Open your legs. I will only stop when my heir is in your womb." The words came out in a low roar that made the crystal chandelier seem to tremble. Rachel Carter was 19 when she was married off to a man she thought would be almost 70. She didn't scream when she first saw him. Didn't scream at how young he was, how dangerously beautiful, how the expensive tailored suit couldn't hide the lethal power coiled in his frame. She told herself he was just a desperate crime lord who needed a womb, not a wife. Someone transactional, someone she could endure until escape became possible. She didn't scream when the bedroom doors closed behind her on their wedding night. Didn't scream when he stood across the room in the dim light, perfectly still, watching her with eyes that missed nothing. But the moment the man she believed would treat this like a cold business arrangement stepped close and gripped her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze while he delivered his demand, that was when everything changed. That was when Rachel realized the truth. She had been claimed by a man powerful enough to dismantle her entire world, patient enough to train her into something lethal, and obsessed enough to make escape not just impossible but unthinkable. And once Kang Tae-jun decided something was his, he burned the world down before he let it go. If you love dark romance where power, danger, and obsession collide, stay with me. Subscribe now, because this story will test your limits and your heart. Now, let's dive into Rachel and Tae-jun's story. The Incheon airport smelled like soju and designer leather, a world away from the small college town in Georgia that Rachel Carter had left behind just 14 hours ago. She stood beside her father in the private terminal, clutching her backpack and trying to ignore the way his leg bounced anxiously as he checked his phone for the 7th time in 10 minutes. Robert Carter had told her this trip was a surprise graduation gift, a father-daughter vacation to celebrate her finishing freshman year, a chance to see Seoul before she got too busy with her pre-med track. Rachel believed him because she needed to. Because at 19, she still thought fathers celebrated their daughters instead of delivering them like packages to settle gambling debts. She adjusted the sundress her father had insisted she wear too formal for travel, but he'd been strangely specific about her looking presentable and tried not to feel the weight of eyes on her. The private terminal was nearly empty, except for 2 men in dark suits standing near the exit, their posture too alert, their attention too focused on her father. A black sedan pulled up outside the tinted glass doors, sleek and armored, with windows so dark Rachel couldn't see inside. Her father's hand clamped around her wrist, his grip desperate enough to hurt, and he pulled her toward the vehicle before she could ask why they weren't going through customs like normal travelers. The driver was a muscular Korean man with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, who nodded at her father with something that looked more like a prison guard acknowledging an inmate than respect. They climbed into the back seat, and Rachel felt cold dread spreading through her chest with every kilometer that took them away from the airport and deeper into the city. Seoul was beautiful in a way that made Rachel's throat tight. All neon-lit skyscrapers and ancient temples nestled between modern buildings and the kind of energy that her travel blogs could never fully capture. But she barely registered any of it because her father wouldn't stop trembling, wouldn't stop whispering what sounded like prayers under his breath, wouldn't meet her eyes when she demanded to know where they were actually going. The car drove through increasingly exclusive neighborhoods, past walls topped with security cameras and gates that required biometric scans, until they reached a private estate that looked like it had been designed to intimidate empires. The driver opened their door, and Rachel stepped out onto stone pavers that probably cost more than her college tuition. The compound was massive. All modern architecture and traditional Korean elements merged into something that screamed wealth and danger. Men in expensive suits stood at strategic positions around the property, their jackets not quite hiding the weapons at their hips or the cold assessment in their eyes. Rachel's stomach dropped as understanding crashed over her like ice water. This wasn't a vacation. This wasn't about celebrating anything. This was a transaction, and she was the payment. Her father walked toward the main house with the shuffling gait of a man walking to his own execution, and Rachel followed because armed men had materialized on either side of her, making the choice for her. The front door opened before they arrived, revealing a sharp-eyed woman in a tailored hanbok who looked at Robert Carter the way someone might look at rotting garbage they were being forced to dispose of. She spoke in rapid Korean, her tone cutting and impatient, and Rachel's father nodded like a dog being scolded, his face gray with fear. Then the woman's gaze shifted to Rachel, examining her with the clinical precision of someone evaluating livestock, and Rachel felt rage beginning to burn through her shock. They were led through corridors lined with contemporary art and traditional scrolls worth fortunes. Rachel counted at least 15 more armed personnel as they walked, all of them looking at her father with expressions ranging from contempt to anticipation, as if waiting for him to try something stupid. They entered a vast room decorated in minimalist luxury, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Seoul's glittering skyline, and that was when Rachel saw him for the first time. Kang Tae-jun sat in a leather chair positioned like a throne, his presence dominating the space despite his stillness. He was young, 30 at most, but age meant nothing compared to the authority that radiated from him like heat from a forge. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit that probably cost more than her father's car, his dark hair styled with careless precision, his face angular and devastatingly handsome in a way that made him more dangerous, not less. This was not the elderly, desperate gang leader she had imagined from her father's vague, terrified descriptions. This was something far worse. Rachel had never seen her father cry before. Not when her mother died, not when the restaurant failed, not even when the bank threatened foreclosure on their house. But now, standing in the private terminal at Incheon Airport with his hand wrapped around her wrist like a shackle, Robert Carter had tears streaming down his face. "Dad, you're scaring me." Rachel tried to pull away, but his grip only tightened. "What's going on? Where are we really going?" He opened his mouth, closed it, then looked away toward the tinted glass doors where the black sedan idled like a predator waiting to strike. The two men in suits had moved closer, no longer pretending they weren't watching every move her father made. "I'm so sorry, baby girl," his voice cracked. "I didn't have a choice. They would have killed me. They would have—" "Who would have killed you?" Rachel's heart hammered against her ribs. "Dad, what did you do?" But she already knew. Deep down, in the part of her that had noticed the gambling problem he thought he'd hidden, the suspicious phone calls at 3 a.m, the way he'd started drinking himself unconscious most nights, she already knew he'd done something unforgivable. "Mr. Carter." The scarred driver had stepped out of the sedan, his English perfect but cold. "It's time." "No." Rachel yanked her arm hard enough to break free. "I'm not going anywhere until someone tells me what the hell is happening." The driver's expression didn't change. He simply raised 2 fingers, and the suited men closed in on either side of her. Not touching her yet, but close enough that she could smell their cologne and see the weapons bulging beneath their jackets. "You owe the Iron Dragon Syndicate $3 million, Mr. Carter." The driver said it casually, as if discussing the weather. "You were given 6 months to pay. You failed. So now, as per the contract you signed, your debt is settled through alternative means." Rachel felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. "Alternative means?" "You." Her father's voice was barely a whisper. "He wants you. Kang Tae-jun. He's willing to forgive everything if you—" He couldn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. The rage that exploded through Rachel was white-hot and blinding. "You sold me? You brought me here and sold me like—" "Please." Her father reached for her again, but she slapped his hand away with enough force to make him stumble. "Please, Rachel, just listen. He's a good man. He's powerful. He can give you everything. He's a gangster." Rachel's voice echoed through the empty terminal. "You sold your daughter to a crime lord to pay off your gambling debts." "He'll treat you well," her father pleaded, desperation making him pathetic. "He's rich. He'll keep you safe. And once you give him a son, you'll have everything you could ever want. Isn't that better than both of us dying?" The driver sighed, apparently bored with the family drama. "Miss Carter, You can walk to the car with dignity, or my associates can carry you. The outcome is the same. Rachel looked at the exit across the terminal. 20 meters, maybe 30. She was fast, she'd run track in high school. But there were at least 6 armed men between her and freedom, and she was in a foreign country with no money, no phone that worked internationally, and no idea how to ask for help in Korean. The math was simple and brutal. She had no moves left to make. I hate you! She looked at her father one last time, memorizing his face so she would never forget what betrayal looked like. For the rest of my life, however long that is, I will hate you. Robert Carter's face crumpled, but Rachel had already turned away. She walked toward the sedan with her head high and her hands steady, even though everything inside her was screaming. The driver opened the door with something that might have been respect flickering in his cold eyes. Smart girl, he murmured as she slid into the leather interior. Kang Tae-jun appreciates intelligence. Rachel didn't respond. She stared straight ahead as the door closed, sealing her inside the expensive cage. Through the tinted window, she watched her father collapse onto a bench, his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking with sobs. She felt nothing. No pity, no forgiveness, no love. Just a cold, crystallizing determination that whoever Kang Tae-jun was, whatever he wanted from her, she would find a way to survive this. And someday, somehow, she would make her father pay for what he'd done. The sedan pulled away from the terminal, carrying her toward a future she hadn't chosen and a man she'd never met. Seoul's lights blurred past the window, beautiful and foreign and utterly indifferent to her terror. Rachel Carter's old life ended in that moment. What came next would be something else entirely. The estate was even more intimidating at night. Rachel was led through the main house by the sharp-eyed woman in the hanbok, who introduced herself only as Mrs. Hwang spoke in clipped sentences that made it clear she had no interest in small talk or sympathy. They climbed a marble staircase to the second floor, down a hallway lined with photographs of stern-faced men in expensive suits, until Mrs. Hwang stopped at a set of double doors carved with intricate dragons. Wait here. She knocked twice, then disappeared before Rachel could respond. Enter. The voice from inside was deep, commanding, and entirely too calm for a man about to meet the woman he'd purchased like property. Rachel's hands trembled as she pushed open the doors. The room beyond was enormous, a private office decorated in dark wood and leather, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined with volumes in Korean, English, and what looked like Japanese. And there, behind a massive desk with his jacket discarded and his shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, sat Kang Tae-jun. He was even more beautiful up close, and Rachel hated him for it. His face was all sharp angles and perfect symmetry, his dark eyes assessing her with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He gestured to one of the leather chairs across from his desk without standing. Sit. I'd rather stand. One dark eyebrow lifted, and something that might have been amusement flickered across his features. Sit, Rachel. We have much to discuss, and I don't negotiate with people who posture. She sat. Not because he'd ordered it, but because her legs were shaking, and she refused to let him see her collapse. Tae-jun leaned back in his chair, studying her with the patience of a predator who knew his prey couldn't escape. Your father owed me $3 million. He gambled it away over the course of 18 months at my establishments in Las Vegas, Seoul, and Macau. When I came to collect, he offered me something more valuable than money. His gaze traveled over her slowly, deliberately. He offered me you. I'm not his to offer. Rachel's voice was steadier than she felt. I'm a human being, not collateral. In your world, perhaps. Tae-jun pulled a folder from his desk drawer and slid it across the polished surface toward her. In mine, debts are paid in whatever currency the debtor possesses. Your father signed a contract 6 months ago. This contract, read it. Rachel opened the folder with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The document was in both English and Korean, stamped with official-looking seals and her father's signature at the bottom. Her stomach turned as she read the terms. In exchange for debt forgiveness, Robert Carter agreed to deliver his daughter Rachel Ann Carter to Kang Tae-jun for the purposes of marriage and producing an heir. The contract included clauses about her care, her living conditions, even the circumstances under which she could be returned if deemed unsuitable. She was livestock, breeding stock, a womb with a college degree. This isn't legal. She threw the folder back across the desk. This is human trafficking, slavery. You can't actually think. I think, Tae-jun interrupted quietly, his voice dropping to something dangerous, that you have two choices. You can accept the terms of this arrangement and live in luxury as my wife, wanting for nothing, protected by the most powerful crime syndicate in Asia. Or I can have your father killed tonight, and you can try to survive in Seoul with no money, no passport. Mrs. Hwang has already taken it, and no understanding of how very far my reach extends. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. You're threatening to kill him. I'm explaining consequences. Tae-jun stood, moving around the desk with the fluid grace of someone trained in violence. He stopped close enough that Rachel had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. Close enough that she could smell his cologne, something dark and expensive that made her dizzy. I don't make idle threats, Rachel. I state facts. Your father's debt is paid, one way or another. The only question is whether you participate willingly. Willingly? Rachel laughed, bitter and sharp. There's nothing willing about this. Then let me be clear about what I'm offering. Tae-jun's hand came up, his fingers catching her chin and forcing her to meet his gaze. His touch was firm but not painful, possessive without being cruel. You will live in this house as my wife. You will have access to everything you desire, education, if you wish to continue it, clothing, jewelry, travel within reason. You will be protected, valued, treated with the respect owed to the woman who will bear my heir. And in exchange? Rachel's voice was barely a whisper. In exchange, you belong to me. His thumb brushed across her lower lip, the gesture intimate and terrifying. You will share my bed. You will carry my child. You will stand at my side as the future of the Iron Dragon Syndicate. And you will never, ever try to leave, because I don't lose what's mine. Rachel wanted to spit in his face, wanted to scream, to fight, to claw at those perfect features until he bled. But she could see the truth in his eyes. He meant every word. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a sentencing. Do we have an understanding? Tae-jun's voice was soft, almost gentle, which made it infinitely more frightening. Rachel swallowed hard, tasting bile and rage and the death of every future she'd imagined for herself. Yes. Good. He released her chin, stepping back to give her space she didn't want. The wedding is in 3 days. Mrs. Hwang will prepare you. Get some rest, Rachel. You're going to need it. She stood on shaking legs and walked toward the door, her spine straight and her head high, even though everything inside her was screaming. Rachel! Tae-jun's voice stopped her at the threshold. She turned, meeting his dark gaze one more time. I'm not a cruel man. Be honest with me. Obey me, and I will give you a life most women would envy. Defy me. His expression hardened into something that made her blood run cold. And you'll learn exactly how patient I can be when teaching lessons. Rachel said nothing. She simply walked out, closing the doors behind her with careful precision. 3 days until her wedding. 3 days until she became the property of a monster in a beautiful suit. 3 days to figure out how to survive what came after. Rachel woke to someone standing over her bed. She jerked upright with a gasp, heart hammering, but the figure didn't move. In the gray light of dawn filtering through the curtains, she could make out a massive man with salt and pepper hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and broken several times. 5 minutes. His accent was thick Italian. Maybe, but his English was clear. Gym clothes in the closet. Don't be late. He was gone before Rachel could respond. The door closing with a quiet click that somehow felt more threatening than if he'd slammed it. She found the clothes exactly where he'd said black leggings, a sports bra, a fitted tank top, all in her size. Of course they were. Taejun probably knew every measurement of her body by now. The thought made her skin crawl as she dressed quickly and followed the sound of voices down to the lower level of the estate. The private gym was easily the size of her entire house back in Georgia. Weight machines, a boxing ring, mats covering half the floor, and so many weapons mounted on the walls in glass cases. The man from her room stood in the center of the mats, arms crossed over a chest that looked like a boulder. "I'm Marco Santini." He didn't offer his hand. "For the next 6 months, I will teach you how not to die. Kang Taejun has many enemies. You are now his most visible weakness. That makes you a target." Rachel's stomach dropped. She hadn't even considered that part of this nightmare. "I don't want to learn how to fight. I want to go home." "Home doesn't exist anymore." Marco's expression didn't change. "You have 2 choices. Learn to protect yourself, or rely entirely on Taejun's men to keep you breathing. Which do you prefer?" The answer should have been obvious: let the guards do their job. But something in Rachel rebelled at the idea of being completely helpless, of depending on the same men who'd kidnapped her for her survival. "Fine." She stepped onto the mats. "Teach me." Marco's smile was brief and sharp. "Good. Now, when someone grabs you from behind like this..." The next hour was humiliating. Marco moved her body like a rag doll, showing her pressure points and breaking grips and how to use her smaller size as an advantage. Every time Rachel thought she'd learned something, he'd switch tactics and put her on the ground again. By the time he called a break, she was covered in sweat and bruises and rage. "You're weak." Marco tossed her a water bottle. "But you're angry. That's more useful than strength." "I'm not weak." Rachel's hands shook as she drank. "I'm untrained. There's a difference." Something like respect flickered in Marco's eyes. "Maybe. We'll see." He checked his watch. 20 minutes. Then language lessons. The language instructor was a tiny woman named Ji-won, who looked like someone's grandmother but had the teaching style of a drill sergeant. She appeared in the gym's adjacent classroom with a stack of books and a tablet, taking one look at Rachel's sweaty, disheveled state and simply pointing to a chair. "Sit. We start with formal greetings. In this house, you will speak Korean. Your husband expects it." "He's not my husband yet." The words came out sharper than Rachel intended. Ji-won's expression didn't change. "In 3 days, he will be. Unless you plan to stand at the altar unable to speak your own vows." She opened the first book. "Now, repeat after me. Annyeonghaseyo." The sounds felt strange in Rachel's mouth, the syllables unfamiliar and clumsy. But Ji-won was relentless, correcting her pronunciation, making her repeat phrases until her throat was raw. Basic greetings, terms of respect, the words for yes, no, please, and thank you. The phrase for "I understand," which felt like a cruel joke given how little Rachel understood about any of this. 2 hours later, her brain felt as bruised as her body. Ji-won finally closed the books, studying Rachel with eyes that missed nothing. "You learn quickly." It didn't sound like a compliment. "That will help you survive. But learning words is not the same as understanding the culture you've entered. Kang Taejun is not just a gangster, child. He is the head of a syndicate with roots going back 300 years. There are rules, expectations, traditions. Break them. And even he cannot always protect you from the consequences." "Maybe I don't want his protection." Rachel met Ji-won's gaze steadily. "Maybe I don't want any of this. What you want stopped mattering the moment your father signed that contract." Ji-won stood, gathering her materials. "Tomorrow, 6 in the morning. We continue." She left, and Rachel sat alone in the classroom, staring at the Korean characters she'd spent the morning learning. The Hangul alphabet looked like a child's building blocks, deceptively simple, hiding layers of complexity she was only beginning to understand. Marco appeared in the doorway. "Lunch. Then we train again. I need a shower first. You need food. Shower after." He jerked his head toward the hallway. "Move." Rachel wanted to argue. but her body was screaming for calories and her brain felt like mush. She followed Marco to a dining room where a meal had already been laid out, Korean food she didn't recognize, though Marco pointed out the names: kimchi, bulgogi, japchae. The flavors exploded on her tongue, spicy and savory and completely foreign. Eat more. Marco pushed the bulgogi toward her. You need strength. Taejun wants you trained, not broken. What's the difference? Rachel stabbed at the meat viciously. I'm here to produce an heir, not be a soldier. You're here to survive. Marco's voice dropped to something almost gentle. I've seen what happens to women who enter this life unprepared. They break. They disappear. They become ghosts in expensive clothes. Taejun gave you a gift by ordering this training. Don't waste it. Rachel looked up at him. Really looked at him for the first time. Behind the granite exterior and the brutal teaching methods, there was something almost protective in Marco's eyes. Why do you care? She asked quietly. Marco was silent for a long moment, then stood. 5-minute break. Then we train until you can break a proper hold. Don't be late. He walked out without answering, leaving Rachel alone with her confusion and her aching muscles and the growing realization that in this beautiful prison, Marco Santini might be the closest thing she had to an ally. Even if that alliance came wrapped in pain and sweat and the slow, brutal education of how to survive in Kang Taejun's world, the dress was a weapon disguised as elegance. Rachel stared at her reflection in the full-length mirror, barely recognizing the woman looking back. The gown was deep emerald silk that clung to every curve before falling in a waterfall of fabric to the floor. Her hair had been styled in an intricate updo that Mrs. Huang had spent an hour perfecting, and the diamonds at her throat and ears probably cost more than her college education. She looked like she belonged in Taejun's world. That was the most terrifying part. He's waiting. Mrs. Huang handed Rachel a small clutch that matched the dress. Remember what I taught you. Polite smile. No opinions unless he asks. Never contradict him in public. You represent the Iron Dragon tonight. Rachel wanted to vomit. Instead, she nodded and walked downstairs on heels that felt like stilts, each step measured and careful. Taejun stood in the foyer, devastating in a black tuxedo that looked custom-made to showcase his lethal elegance. His eyes traveled over her slowly, and something dark flickered in their depths. Perfect! He extended his arm. Stay close to me tonight. Some of the men attending are allies. Others are rivals barely maintaining a truce. All of them will be evaluating you. Evaluating me for what? Rachel slipped her hand into the crook of his elbow, hating how natural the gesture felt. For weaknesses. Taejun led her toward the waiting car. For whether you're worthy of standing beside me. For whether I've made a mistake. The gala was held at a private estate even larger than Taejun's, the ballroom glittering with crystal chandeliers and filled with the most dangerous people Rachel had ever seen. They wore designer suits and couture gowns, drank champagne that probably cost thousands per bottle, and smiled at each other with the cold calculation of predators at a watering hole. Taejun kept her close, one hand resting possessively on the small of her back as he navigated the room. He introduced her in Korean to various men and their wives, names she struggled to remember, faces that blurred together in a sea of polite hostility. Kang Taejun. A voice cut through the crowd, smooth and mocking. I heard rumors you'd finally found a bride. How unexpected. The man approaching was tall and sharp-featured, with slicked-back hair and a smile that made Rachel's skin crawl. 2 other men flanked him, both watching Taejun with barely concealed contempt. Jin Ho! Taejun's voice remained pleasant, but Rachel felt the tension coil through his body. I'm surprised you accepted the invitation. I thought you'd be busy rebuilding after the Busan incident. Jinho's smile thinned. Water under the bridge. I'm more interested in your acquisition. His gaze slid to Rachel, dismissive and insulting. American, isn't she? I suppose when one can't secure a proper alliance through marriage, one settles for purchased goods. The words hit Rachel like a slap. Around them, conversations quieted as people turned to watch the confrontation. Taejun's hand tightened on her back, a warning to stay silent. But Rachel had spent 3 weeks being treated like property, learning to fight, learning to survive. She was done being silent. Purchased goods? Rachel's voice rang out clear and cold, her Korean carefully pronounced exactly as Ji-won had taught her. How interesting. And what does that make you, Mr. Jin-ho? The man so desperate for relevance that he insults a woman at a formal gathering? Jin-ho's expression darkened. Careful, girl. You don't know who you're speaking to. I know exactly who I'm speaking to. Rachel stepped forward, away from Taejun's protective hold, meeting Jin-ho's gaze without flinching. I'm speaking to the head of a failing territory who lost 3 shipments and 2 key warehouses in Busan last month. A man whose own allies are quietly distancing themselves because they've realized he's a sinking ship. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. Rachel could feel Taejun's shock radiating behind her, could see the fury building in Jin-ho's face. Where I come from, Rachel continued, switching to English now, letting her contempt show. We have a saying, don't start a fight you can't finish. You came over here to embarrass my husband in front of his peers, but you've only embarrassed yourself by revealing that you see me as a threat. Why else would you bother insulting someone you claim to view as beneath you? Jin-ho's hand twitched toward his jacket, and Rachel felt Marco materialize somewhere behind her, a silent threat. But it was Taejun who moved, stepping up beside Rachel with an expression of dark satisfaction. My wife makes an excellent point. Taejun's voice was silk over steel. Perhaps you should focus on rebuilding your own house before concerning yourself with mine, Jin-ho. Unless you'd like to discuss the Busan situation in more detail? Jin-ho's face went white with rage, but he was trapped. To escalate now would be to admit Rachel's accusations held truth. This isn't over, Kang. It never is. Taejun smiled, cold and sharp. Enjoy the evening. Jin-ho stormed away with his men, and slowly, conversation resumed around the ballroom. Rachel felt her legs start to shake with delayed adrenaline, but she kept her spine straight until Taejun guided her toward a quieter corner of the room. Where, he asked quietly, his hand coming up to cup her face, did you learn about the Busan situation? Marco. Rachel met his eyes. He's been teaching me more than self-defense. He says if I'm going to survive in your world, I need to understand the board. All the pieces, all the players. Taejun studied her for a long moment, and Rachel couldn't read the expression in his dark eyes. Then slowly, deliberately, he leaned down and pressed a kiss to her forehead. You humiliated one of my biggest rivals in front of the entire Seoul underground. His voice was low, meant only for her. You defended my reputation without needing my protection. Do you understand what you've just done? Started a war? Rachel's voice trembled slightly. No. Taejun's thumb brushed across her cheekbone, the gesture surprisingly tender. You proved you belong here? That you're not just the woman in my bed, but the woman at my side. Jin-ho won't forget this. But neither will anyone else in this room. He took her hand, lacing their fingers together in a gesture that felt more intimate than anything they'd shared before. Come, let me introduce you properly to the people who matter. My wife has made quite the first impression. As Taejun led her back into the crowd, Rachel caught her reflection in one of the ballroom's massive mirrors. The woman looking back at her was poised, dangerous, and completely unrecognizable from the terrified girl who'd arrived in Seoul 3 weeks ago. She didn't know if that was a victory or a tragedy, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty: she'd just crossed a line there was no coming back from. Rachel Carter was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone who could survive in this world of violence and power, someone who might even thrive in it. Rachel found Taejun in his office at 2 a.m, surrounded by papers and satellite images spread across his desk like the pieces of a deadly puzzle. He'd discarded his jacket hours ago, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his tie loosened. He looked younger like this, Less like the untouchable crime lord and more like a man carrying the weight of impossible decisions. She'd meant to walk past his door, to return to her own bedroom after another sleepless night. But something made her stop. Something in the tension of his shoulders that felt familiar after weeks of watching him command his empire. Can't sleep either? Rachel leaned against the doorframe, wearing nothing but an oversized silk robe that Mrs. Huang had left in her room. Taejun looked up, surprise flickering across his features, before settling into something warmer. Shin-ho is making moves, reaching out to the Yakuza, trying to build an alliance against me. I need to anticipate his next play. May I? Rachel gestured to the papers. He hesitated, then nodded. Rachel crossed the room, studying the documents with the analytical eye she'd developed over weeks of Marco's strategic lessons, shipping manifests, surveillance photos, communications intercepts. The pieces of Jin-ho's operation laid bare. Here, Rachel pointed to a warehouse location on one of the satellite images. This is his primary distribution hub for the southern territories. He's routing everything through Gwangju now that Busan is compromised. If you wanted to pressure him, this is the leverage point. Taejun stood, moving to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. How did you know that? Marco's been teaching me to read supply chains, and Ji-won mentioned that Jin-ho's cousin runs operations in Gwangju. Family connections mean vulnerabilities. Rachel traced the routes on the map with one finger. Cut off his supply line here, and he'll be desperate. Desperate people make mistakes. You're thinking like a strategist. Taejun's voice held something that might have been pride. Like someone born to this life. I'm thinking like someone who wants to survive it. Rachel turned to face him and suddenly realized how close they were standing. Close enough to see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. Close enough to smell his cologne mixed with the whiskey he'd been drinking. There's a difference. Is there? Taejun's hand came up, brushing a strand of hair back from her face. The gesture was gentle, almost tender, completely at odds with the man who'd threatened her father's life and laid out her future like a business transaction. You could have stayed silent at the gala, could have let me handle Jin-ho, but you chose to fight. Not because you had to, because you wanted to. I was angry. Rachel's breath caught as his fingers lingered against her cheek. He called me property. You are mine. Taejun's voice dropped lower, intimate and possessive. But you were right to remind him that being mine means being untouchable, being protected, being powerful. His thumb traced the line of her jaw. You surprised me tonight, Rachel. You've surprised me every day since you arrived. I've surprised myself. The admission came out barely above a whisper. Rachel knew she should step back, should maintain the careful distance she'd built between them. But something in this moment felt different, real, like the performance they'd been staging for weeks had cracked open to reveal something raw underneath. I didn't want this. Taejun's other hand came up to frame her face, his touch achingly gentle. When your father offered you, I saw a transaction, a means to an end, an heir to secure my position. I didn't expect. What? Rachel's heart was hammering against her ribs. What didn't you expect? You? The word was rough, almost pained. I didn't expect you to be brilliant, to be fierce, to stand in front of a room full of killers and make them see you as a queen instead of a victim. His forehead touched hers, and Rachel felt the careful control he'd maintained for weeks starting to fracture. I didn't expect to want you like this. Rachel should have been terrified, should have remembered that this man had bought her, owned her, had made it clear she was a possession to be used. But standing in the dim light of his office with his hands cradling her face like something precious, she couldn't remember why keeping her distance mattered. Tae-jun. He kissed her before she could finish, and it was nothing like the clinical, contractual joining she'd been dreading. This was hunger and heat and desperation, his mouth claiming hers with a possessiveness that made her knees weak. Rachel gasped against his lips, and he took advantage, deepening the kiss, one hand sliding into her hair, while the other gripped her waist and pulled her flush against him. She should have pushed him away, should have maintained the cold distance that protected her heart. Instead, Rachel found herself kissing him back, her hands fisting in his shirt, her body arching into his with a need that terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Taejun rested his forehead against hers again. His eyes closed like he was memorizing the moment. "This changes nothing." His voice was rough. "You're still mine. Still bound by our agreement." "I know." Rachel's hands were shaking where they pressed against his chest. "This doesn't mean I forgive you. Doesn't mean I've forgotten what you are." "Good." Taejun's eyes opened, dark and burning with something that looked dangerously like affection. "I don't want your forgiveness. I want your fire, your intelligence, your defiance." He kissed her again, softer this time, almost reverent. "I want all of you, Rachel. Not just the air you'll give me. Everything." Rachel pulled back, her mind spinning, her heart racing. "I need to go." "Stay." It wasn't a command. It was a request, vulnerable and honest. "Just stay. Help me finish this. Then we'll both sleep." She should have said no, should have protected herself from the dangerous feelings coiling in her chest. But Rachel found herself nodding, pulling away from his embrace only to return to the desk, to the maps, and the strategies that suddenly felt less like prison bars and more like a shared language they were learning together. They worked until dawn, their hands occasionally brushing as they moved papers, their eyes meeting across the desk with a new understanding crackling between them. And when the sun finally rose over Seoul, painting the office in shades of gold and amber, Rachel realized with terrifying clarity that somewhere between the anger and the fear and the survival, she'd started to fall for the man who owned her. That was the most dangerous thing of all. The call came at midnight. Rachel was in the library with Ji-won, practicing formal business Korean, when she heard Taejun's voice echo through the hallway, sharp, urgent, dangerous. Moments later, he appeared in the doorway, already pulling on his jacket, Marco and 4 other guards flanking him. "There's a situation at the Incheon warehouse. I need to handle it personally." His eyes locked on Rachel's. "Stay inside. Marco's team will remain here with you." "I'll be back before dawn." Something in his tone made Rachel's instinct scream. "What kind of situation?" "The kind that requires my immediate attention." Taejun crossed to her, cupping her face in a gesture that had become familiar over the past weeks. "Promise me you'll stay inside. Don't open the doors for anyone except my men." "I promise." The words felt heavy on her tongue. He kissed her forehead, then was gone, taking half the estate's security with him. Ji-won gathered her materials with trembling hands. "I should go home. It's not safe," he said to stay inside. Rachel touched the older woman's arm. "You're safer here than on the streets if something's happening." They returned to the lesson, but Rachel couldn't focus. Something felt wrong. Taejun had been on edge all evening, checking his phone obsessively, speaking in rapid Korean to his lieutenants. And the call had come too conveniently, pulling him away from the estate with most of his best men. 30 minutes later, the power went out. Rachel's blood ran cold as darkness swallowed the estate. Ji-won gasped, gripping Rachel's arm. Emergency lights flickered on after a moment, bathing everything in eerie red. The backup generator should have kicked in immediately. Rachel moved to the library window, peering out into the grounds. The perimeter lights were dead, the security cameras she'd learned to spot during Marco's training all dark. Then she saw movement. Shadows crossing the lawn, too many shadows, moving with military precision toward the house. "Ji-won, we need to move. Now." Rachel grabbed the older woman's hand, pulling her toward the door. Her mind raced through the estate's layout. Marco had made her memorize every entrance, every weak point, every place an attacker might breach. They'd barely reached the hallway when glass shattered somewhere below. Shouts erupted in Korean, followed by the distinctive crack of gunfire. "The panic room." Ji-won's voice was thin with terror. "Taejun has a panic room in his office." "Too far. They're already inside." Rachel's training kicked in, drowning out the fear. Marco's voice echoed in her head. When trapped, go up, not down. Height is an advantage. She pulled G1 toward the back staircase, the one the servants used, the one most intruders wouldn't know about. More gunfire. Closer now. A scream cut short. Rachel's heart hammered, but her hands stayed steady as she guided G1 up the narrow stairs. They made it to the 3rd floor before Rachel heard footsteps below, heavy and purposeful. She pushed G1 into a storage room, pressing a finger to her lips. The older woman nodded, her face pale in the red emergency lighting. Rachel grabbed what she could, a heavy brass candlestick from a hallway table, her phone to call for help, though the service was dead. Jammed, probably. These weren't amateurs. The footsteps grew closer. A man's voice, speaking Korean she couldn't fully understand, but the tone was clear, searching, hunting. Rachel positioned herself behind the door, the candlestick raised, every muscle coiled. Marco's training played through her mind. Strike fast, strike hard, strike to disable. The throat, the temple, the knee. Make every hit count. The door swung open. The man was enormous, dressed in black tactical gear, a gun in one hand. He stepped into the room, scanning left, and Rachel brought the candlestick down on his wrist with every ounce of strength she possessed. Bone cracked. The gun clattered to the floor. The man roared in pain and rage, spinning toward her. But Rachel was already moving. Marco had drilled it into her. Never stop after one strike. She drove her knee into his groin, and when he doubled over, brought the candlestick up under his chin with a sickening crunch. He went down hard, blood pouring from his mouth. Rachel grabbed his gun with shaking hands, the weight unfamiliar and terrifying. Marco had shown her how to shoot, but holding a weapon in a training exercise was nothing like holding one over a bleeding man who'd come to kill her. Rachel? G1's whisper was terrified. Stay down. Rachel moved to the doorway, checking the hall. More footsteps, multiple sets, spreading through the floor. They were searching room by room. Her phone buzzed suddenly, a text breaking through whatever jamming they'd used. Taejun. Trap. On my way. Hide. Relief and terror flooded through her in equal measure. He knew. He was coming. She just had to survive until he arrived. Another figure appeared at the end of the hallway. Rachel raised the gun, her hand steady, despite the fear screaming through her veins. The man saw her and smiled, raising his own weapon. Marco's voice in her head. Aim for center mass. Breathe out. Squeeze, don't pull. Rachel fired. The recoil nearly knocked her backward, her ears ringing from the shot in the enclosed space. The man staggered, clutching his shoulder, his gun falling. She'd missed center mass, but she'd hit him. American bitch! He lunged forward despite the wound, and Rachel fired again. This time she didn't miss. He collapsed, and Rachel stood frozen, staring at what she'd done. She'd just killed a man. Actually killed someone. The gun trembled in her grip as reality crashed over her. More shouts from below. An engine roaring outside. Then Taejun's voice, cold and lethal, speaking rapid-fire Korean. The sounds of fighting intensified, then gradually ceased. Rachel! Taejun's voice echoed through the estate, frantic. Rachel! Here! Her voice cracked. 3rd floor! Footsteps thundered up the stairs, and then Taejun was there. Blood spattered across his shirt, his eyes wild until they locked on her. He crossed the distance in 3 strides, crushing her against his chest. You're alive. You're alive. His hands ran over her frantically, checking for wounds. Are you hurt? No. Rachel's voice broke. G1. I got G1 to safety. But she gestured to the bodies, unable to form the words. Taejun looked at the dead men, then back at Rachel, and something fierce and proud blazed in his eyes. You survived. You fought. You protected what's mine. He kissed her hard, tasting of violence and desperation. My deadly, beautiful wife. Rachel started shaking then, the adrenaline crashing, and Taejun held her through it, whispering in Korean against her hair. Words she didn't fully understand, but the tone was clear. She was his, and he would burn down the world to keep her safe. But tonight, she'd proven she could burn it down herself. The estate was a war zone. Rachel sat in Taejun's office, wrapped in a blanket someone had draped over her shoulders, watching through the windows as body bags were loaded into unmarked vans. 7 attackers dead, 3 of Taejun's guards wounded. 2 more who would never come home. The numbers felt abstract, unreal, like something from a movie rather than her actual life. Jiwon had been taken to a secure location, shaken but unharmed. Marco was coordinating the cleanup, his face carved from stone as he barked orders in Italian-accented Korean. And Taejun stood across the room with his back to her, one hand braced against the wall, his shoulders rigid with tension he wouldn't release. He'd barely spoken since the initial aftermath, since holding her while she shook. Once he'd confirmed she was physically unharmed, something had shuddered behind his eyes. He'd transformed back into the ice dragon. Cold, controlled, lethal. Men had been dispatched with curt orders, phone calls made in clipped tones, the machine of his empire clicking into motion to find who'd orchestrated the attack and make them suffer. But he wouldn't look at her. Taejun. Rachel's voice sounded foreign to her own ears. Talk to me. You should rest. His voice was flat, empty. Mrs. Huang has prepared a guest room. The master bedroom is part of the crime scene. I don't want to rest. I want you to look at me. His hand curled into a fist against the wall, the only sign he'd heard her. This is my fault. The words came out raw, scraped from somewhere deep. They used me to draw you away. Jinho knew he knew you'd come running if he created a crisis important enough. And while you were gone, while most of your men were gone, they came for you. They came for me and I killed them. Rachel stood, the blanket falling away. I'm not some fragile thing that broke tonight. I survived. I protected your household. Why are you acting like I'm the one who needs to be handled? Taejun finally turned, and the expression on his face made Rachel's breath catch. It wasn't cold calculation or controlled fury. It was devastation, raw and terrible. I came back to find you standing over bodies with blood on your hands. His voice cracked. You were shaking so hard you couldn't put the gun down. Do you understand what that means? What I've done to you? What you've done to me? Rachel crossed the room, anger and something deeper burning in her chest. You gave me the tools to survive. You had Marco train me, teach me strategy, show me how to fight. Tonight that training saved my life and Jiwon's. How is that something to regret? You shouldn't need those skills. Taejun's control finally shattered, his voice rising. You should be in college, studying medicine, worrying about exams and parties and normal things that 19-year-old girls worry about. Not killing men in my hallway because I brought you into a world that wants you dead. You didn't bring me here. My father did. Rachel grabbed his shirt, forcing him to meet her eyes. You didn't make me property. He did. You just bought what was already for sale. That doesn't make it right. Taejun's hands came up to grip her wrists, but he didn't pull her away. When I saw those bodies, when I realized you'd fought them alone, that you could have died while I was chasing a phantom crisis. His voice broke completely. I can't lose you, Rachel. I know I have no right to feel that way, but I can't. Rachel felt something shift inside her chest, like a wall she'd built crumbling into dust. She'd spent weeks telling herself this was temporary, that she'd find a way out, that her feelings for him were just survival instinct. But standing here watching this brutal, powerful man fall apart at the thought of losing her, she couldn't lie anymore. Then don't. The words came out soft, certain. Don't lose me. Don't push me away because you feel guilty. Don't treat me like I'm broken. You killed someone tonight! Taejun's thumbs brushed over her pulse points, feeling her heartbeat. That changes you, scars you. I know. Rachel stepped closer, until their bodies were pressed together, until she could feel his heart racing against hers. But I'm not running from it. I'm not running from you. I'm not running anymore. Something blazed in Taejun's eyes, hope and hunger and desperate relief. Rachel, I hated you. She needed him to understand, needed to say it all. I hated you for buying me, for trapping me, for making me into something I never wanted to be. But somewhere between the fear and the fighting and the nights working beside you, I stopped hating. I started seeing the man behind the monster. And tonight, when I thought I might die, the only thing I could think about was that I'd never told you. He kissed her before she could finish, and this time there was no careful control, no measured seduction. This was raw need and overwhelming relief, his hands tangling in her hair, his body pressing her back against the desk. Rachel kissed him back with equal desperation, pouring everything she couldn't say into the connection between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Taejun rested his forehead against hers. His eyes closed. I love you. The confession came out hoarse, like it hurt him to say it. I know I have no right. I know this started as a transaction. But somewhere between your defiance and your brilliance and your refusal to break, I fell in love with you. Rachel's breath caught. She should have been terrified by those words, should have recognized them as just another chain. But all she felt was a fierce, overwhelming certainty. Then love me. She pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. Love me as an equal, not property. Love me as your partner, not your possession. And let me love you back. You love me? Taejun's hands framed her face like she was something precious and fragile. Even after everything? Especially after everything. Rachel smiled, sad and true. You're a monster, Kang Taejun. But you're my monster, and I'm done pretending I want to escape. He kissed her again, slower this time, reverent. And when he lifted her onto the desk, when his hands slid under her shirt and her legs wrapped around his waist, it wasn't a transaction or a contract or a reproductive demand. It was surrender. For both of them. The war was over, and somehow, impossibly, they'd both won. Rachel stared at the two pink lines, her hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped the test. Pregnant. She was pregnant. The bathroom suddenly felt too small, the air too thin. She'd known, of course, her period was 3 weeks late, and the nausea that hit her every morning wasn't from stress. But seeing the confirmation, holding the physical proof in her hands, made it devastatingly real. There was a child growing inside her. Taejun's child. The heir he'd demanded the night he'd made her his wife. The original purpose of this entire arrangement. Rachel sank onto the edge of the bathtub, still clutching the test. She should feel trapped, should feel like the final piece of his plan had clicked into place. But all she felt was a fierce, overwhelming protectiveness for the tiny life she carried. This baby hadn't asked to be conceived as part of a transaction, hadn't asked to be born into a world of violence and power plays. This baby deserved better than to be just an heir. Deserved to be loved, protected, wanted for more than what they represented. Rachel? Taejun's voice came from the bedroom. Are you all right? You've been in there for 20 minutes. She opened the door, still holding the test, unable to form words. But she didn't need to. Taejun's eyes dropped to her hand, to the unmistakable pink lines, and his entire body went rigid. For one terrible moment, Rachel couldn't read his expression. Then he crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and pulled her against his chest, his hands cradling the back of her head. A baby. His voice was rough with emotion. We're having a baby. Are you... Rachel's voice caught. Are you happy? Taejun pulled back just enough to look at her, and the expression on his face was nothing like the cold demand he'd made on their wedding night. This was wonder and fear and overwhelming joy all tangled together. Happy doesn't begin to cover it. He pressed a kiss to her forehead, then her cheeks, then her lips, terrified, grateful, completely undone. His hand moved to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "You're carrying my child. Our child." Rachel felt tears sliding down her cheeks. "I know this was the plan all along. I know this is what you bought me for. But I need you to promise me something. Anything." Taejun wiped her tears away with his thumbs. "Name it. Promise me this baby will be more than just an heir. More than just security for your empire. Promise me they'll be loved, cherished, given the choice to be whoever they want to be." "Rachel," Taejun's voice was fierce, "the moment I found out you existed, this child became more than an heir. They became the future, not just of the Iron Dragon, but of us. Everything I've built, everything I've fought for, it's all for them now." He kissed her again, reverent and possessive. "And I will burn this entire world down before I let anyone threaten them." The purge began 3 days later. Rachel watched from Taejun's office as he systematically dismantled the most dangerous parts of his empire. Men who'd served him for years were called in, evaluated, and either promoted or eliminated based on a single criterion. Could they be trusted with his child's safety? Jinho Rossetti was found dead in a Busan warehouse, 3 bullets in his chest. The message was clear: the man who'd orchestrated the villa attack had paid with his life. Too quick. Marco stood beside Rachel at the window, his arms crossed. "I would have made him suffer longer." Taejun wanted to send a message, not satisfy a grudge. Rachel watched as another black car pulled away from the estate. Quick deaths are still deaths. The important part is that Jinho's entire network knows what happens when they threaten his family. Marco glanced at her, something like pride in his eyes. "You sound like him now, like a dragon yourself." "Maybe I am." Rachel's hand drifted unconsciously to her stomach. "I'm certainly protecting my horde." Over the next 2 weeks, Taejun restructured everything. Shell companies were dissolved. Legitimate businesses were established to launder money and provide clean income. The weapons trafficking that had been the syndicate's backbone for generations was gradually phased out in favor of less violent enterprises. "You're dismantling your grandfather's legacy." Rachel reviewed the paperwork late one night, Taejun's head resting on her lap as she ran her fingers through his hair. "The old guard won't accept this easily. The old guard doesn't have a choice." Taejun's hand covered hers on her stomach, both of them cradling the life growing there. "My grandfather built an empire on blood. I'm going to transform it into something that won't require our child to become a monster to inherit it." "They'll call you weak." Rachel had learned enough about the syndicate's culture to know this kind of change would be seen as surrender. "Let them." Taejun sat up, pulling her into his arms. "I've spent my entire life proving I'm strong enough to lead through violence. Now I'll prove I'm strong enough to lead through change. And anyone who can't accept that will be removed." The removals were methodical and brutal. Taejun's most violent lieutenants were given generous severance packages and relocated to distant territories. The ones who refused were dealt with permanently. Within a month, the Iron Dragon Syndicate looked nothing like it had when Rachel first arrived. "You're making enemies," Mrs. Huang warned during one of Rachel's Korean lessons. "The Yakuza think you've made him soft. The Chinese triads smell weakness." "They're wrong." Rachel's hand moved to her stomach, which had just started to show the slightest curve. "Taejun isn't weak. He's evolving. And evolution is survival." That night, Rachel found Taejun on the bedroom balcony, staring out over Seoul's glittering skyline. She wrapped her arms around him from behind, pressing her cheek against his back. "Regrets?" she asked softly. "Never." His hands covered hers. "I'm building a world where our child can choose their own path, where they won't be forced into this life the way I was, the way you were." He turned to face her, his eyes intense. "I can't erase what I am, Rachel. Can't undo the things I've done. But I can make sure our son or daughter has options. Freedom. Choice." Rachel reached up to cup his face. "You're going to be an incredible father." "I'm going to try." Taejun's hand moved to her stomach, his touch reverent. "For you. For them. I'll be whatever I need to be." He kissed her then, slow and deep, and Rachel felt their baby flutter for the first time, a tiny movement, barely perceptible, but unmistakably real. Life, growing between them, transforming them both into something neither had expected to become. A family, not built on contracts or transactions or demands roared on wedding nights, but on choice, on love, on the fierce determination to give their child the freedom they'd both been denied. The dragon was changing its scales, and the world would just have to adapt. 3 years later, Rachel stood on the terrace of their coastal villa, watching the sun set over the East Sea. The ocean stretched endlessly before her, painted in shades of amber and rose, while behind her she could hear the delighted shrieks of her daughter chasing after Taejun through the garden. "Appa! Too fast!" Minseo's voice rang out in Korean, her father's language as natural to her as breathing. "I'm letting you win, little dragon." Taejun's laugh was warm, unguarded, a sound that still surprised Rachel even after years of marriage. "Come catch me." Rachel smiled, one hand drifting unconsciously to her rounded belly. 6 months pregnant with their second child, a boy this time, though Taejun had made it clear he didn't care about gender. He just wanted them both healthy, wanted their family safe. The villa was a far cry from the fortress in Seoul. Here, surrounded by private beach and protected by security systems that didn't require armed guards on every corner, they'd built something that felt almost normal, almost peaceful, almost free. "She has your speed." Marco appeared beside Rachel, his hair more silver now, but his posture still military straight. He'd retired from active enforcement 2 years ago, but remained their closest friend, their daughter's godfather, the man who'd taught Rachel how to survive becoming someone else entirely. "She has his stubbornness." Rachel watched as Minso finally tackled Taejun's legs, both of them tumbling onto the grass in a tangle of limbs and laughter, and his complete disregard for the word impossible. "She has your fire." Marco's voice was gentle. "Your refusal to be anything less than sovereign." Rachel turned to look at him. "Sovereign? I'm still the woman who was sold to settle a debt." "No." Marco shook his head firmly. "You were that woman. Past tense. Now you're the woman who transformed an empire, who convinced the most dangerous man in Asia to choose love over legacy, who stands beside him not as property, but as an equal." He gestured toward where Taejun was now holding Minseo up to look at the sunset, both of them silhouetted against the fading light. "Look at him. Really look. That man would burn the world for you, not because he owns you, but because you own him." Rachel felt tears prick her eyes. She remembered the girl who'd arrived in Seoul terrified and alone, the girl who'd thought survival meant escape. She'd been so focused on finding a way out that she'd never considered there might be a way through. "I never expected to be happy." The confession came out soft. "When my father told me what he'd done, when I realized I was being traded like property, I thought happiness was impossible. I thought I'd spend my life looking for exits, planning escapes, counting days until I could run." "When did you stop planning to run?" Marco asked. Rachel thought back to the villa attack, to standing over bodies with blood on her hands, to Taejun's devastated face when he'd found her alive, to the moment she'd realized that running from him meant running from herself, from the woman she'd become, fierce and dangerous and powerful. "I stopped planning to run the moment I realized I'd found what I was really looking for." She touched her belly, feeling her son move beneath her palm. Not freedom from him, freedom with him. Partnership. Choice. Love. Minseo's laughter carried on the evening breeze, pure and bright. Rachel watched as Taejun lifted their daughter onto his shoulders, pointing out the boats in the distance, teaching her about the ocean the same way he taught her about business and strategy and how to be both gentle and lethal. He was a different man than the one who'd gripped her chin on their wedding night and demanded an heir. Or perhaps he was the same man, just finally allowed to be more than the ice dragon, allowed to be a husband, a father, a partner, allowed to choose love over duty. Aoma! Minseo waved frantically from Taejun's shoulders. Come see! Appa says the moon will be big tonight. Rachel walked down the terrace steps, Marco trailing behind to give the family space. Taejun's eyes found hers across the garden, and the look in them still made her breath catch devotion, desire, wonder that she'd chosen to stay, to love him, to build this life together. He lowered Minseo to the ground, and the 3-year-old immediately latched onto Rachel's legs, chattering about the boats and the birds and the shells she'd found on the beach. Happy? Taejun's arms came around Rachel from behind, his hands joining hers on her belly, their daughter pressed between them in a warm tangle of family. Deliriously, Rachel leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. Though I never imagined happiness would look like this. What did you imagine? His lips brushed her temple. Escaping. Running. Getting as far from you as possible. She turned in his arms, looking up at the man who'd once bought her and now belonged to her just as completely as she belonged to him. I imagined freedom meant being alone. And now? Rachel cupped his face, her thumb tracing the sharp line of his jaw. Now I know freedom means choosing who to be bound to. And I choose you. Every day, I choose you. Taejun kissed her, soft and deep, while Minseo made exaggerated gagging sounds and demanded they stop being gross. When they pulled apart, both laughing, the sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold. Come, Taejun scooped Minseo up with one arm, his other hand finding Rachel's. Let's go inside. Mrs. Huang made your favorite dinner. As they walked toward the villa, a family now instead of a transaction, Rachel thought about the girl she'd been. The terrified 19-year-old who'd thought her life was ending in that Seoul airport. She'd been right, in a way, that life had ended. But this life, this beautiful, complicated, fierce life built on ashes and choice and relentless love had risen in its place. Rachel wasn't the sold girl anymore. She wasn't the victim or the prisoner or the breeding stock. She was the sovereign, the queen of an empire transformed, the woman who'd tamed a dragon not by breaking him, but by teaching him to fly. And as the stars began to emerge over the East Sea, as her husband held their daughter and her son kicked beneath her heart, Rachel understood the truth she'd been too afraid to see in those early days. Sometimes the best freedom isn't escape. Sometimes it's surrender to exactly where you belong.